All right, let's continue on with the heart. The cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle is defined as the performance of the heart within one heartbeat. Now, the cardiac cycle consists of two phases: systole and diastole. So the two phases are systole and diastole. So in systole, it is where you have the contraction of the heart to eject blood out of the heart and into the circuits. Do keep in mind is that both sides of the heart operate at the same time. So when they contract, they eject the blood out into the two circuits. Diastole is the phase in which you have relaxation of the heart as blood returns back into the heart from the two circuits. So as you see from the image at the bottom image right here, going from the left to the right, we have what's known as contraction, which represents systole, relaxation, which represents diastole. So these are the two phases of the heart, of the cardiac cycle, I should say. So we have contraction, which represents systole, and relaxation, which represents diastole. So you have the two phases of the cardiac cycle. And the whole cardiac cycle is coordinated by the conduction system of the heart. So what exactly is the conduction system of the heart? The conduction system is defined as, so the conduction system is system of the heart represents or consists of a group of specialized cardiac muscle cells that are able to generate electrical signals to innervate the cardiac muscles. So these muscle cells are very, very special in the sense that they are able to produce electrical signals to innervate the cardiac muscles involved with contraction and relaxation. All right, very good. Any question on this? Write on your question, and you can join me at a Q&A session, and you can ask me the question, and I would address your question. Very good. Moving on to the next slide. So moving on to the conduction system of the heart. As I mentioned a while back, the conduction system of the heart is a group of specialized cardiac muscles cells with the ability to generate electrical signals to innervate the heart muscles involved with relaxation and contraction. So the conduction system of the heart is composed of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Number 1, sinoatrial node, or often referred to as SA node. So S stands for sino, A for atrial node. So the sinoatrial node can be found in the right atrium, and it is referred to as the intrinsic pacemaker. Now, what that means is that the SA node generates or sets the heart rate, or what we can say is this, or what we can say is going to be, so it actually produces or sets the heart rate in a sense is that it produces the number of electrical signals to innervate the heart muscles. So in essence, it sets the heart rate. Okay. The internodal fibers. So when you think of the word inter, it means in between. The internodal fibers can be seen right here, which I drew as XXX. So the internodal fibers are also found in the right atrium, and to be more precise, in between the SA node and the AV node. And for that reason, it says internodal fibers. Continuation to the atrioventricular, or known as AV node. The AV node can be found in the right atrium. So if you look at number 2 right here in the image, that represents what's known as the AV node. So I'm going to check off right now. I'll put a check next to the SA node. So this is the SA node. Okay, and I'll put a check, a different color check on this. And you know what? I'm going to erase the X, because I'll erase the X right here, and which allows me to put the little check. I'll use it black check, black color check. This is a check. I'll make it bigger. That represents what's known as the SA node. Okay, I'll do the next check, which represents what's known as the internodal fibers. And I'll put another check next to this for the AV node. Now the next one is going to be, the next component is going to be known as the AV bundle, or AV bundle of His. And the AV bundle is found in the right atrium, okay, and also in the interventricular septum. So I'm going to put a little dot. I'll do another check, the X. Let's do the X. I'll put an X on the what's known as the bundle, the AV bundle, right here. I'll move the X over, and I'll put it on the AV bundle, and I'll make it bigger, and this is the AV bundle. All right. Yeah, I'll make it smaller to make it easier for you to see. Now let's move on to the next one. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the next one. It's gonna be and the AV bundle, by the way, is also what bifurcates. The AV bundle bifurcates. So the AV bundle bifurcates into the left and right bundle branches. So the AV bundle will bifurcate into the left and right bundle branches. And as you can see, the left and the right bundle branches, so I'll make it an X bigger so you can see more of it, the X. And then the X will bifurcate. And the word bifurcate means, splits into. So the AV bundle bifurcates or splits into the left and right bundle branches. And the left and right bundle branches can be found in the interventricular septum and the wall of the ventricles. So you can see from this image, the bottom image that we can see is that this represents what's known as the left and the right bundle branches, and also this also represents what's known as the right bundle branch and the left bundle branch right here as well. And the Purkinje fibers represent what's known as, Purkinje fibers are going to be known as the Purkinje cells or Purkinje fibers or Purkinje fibers. They are, so Purkinje fibers are terminal fibers emerge from the bundle branches, and they are found in the wall of the ventricles. So if I zoom in, you can see that, so when I zoom in, you can see that, so let's go one by one is this, okay. So first one, so let me erase everything right here is this, let's erase everything and we'll go over one by one, and let's go out one by one on this, okay. So number one, SA node. Number two, internodal cells or fibers. And internodal fibers actually. Number three is going to be known as AV node. Number four is going to be known as bundle, AV bundle or AV bundle his. And number five, the left and the right bundle branches. And number six, you have these little branch that comes out. They are known as Purkinje fibers. You can see the Purkinje fibers, and you can see the Purkinje fibers. So all these six components represent what's known as the conduction system of the heart. Any question? Write down your question and we will discuss the question in the Q&A session. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, let's move on to what's known as the electrocardiogram, which is abbreviated as ECG or EKG. Okay. So the EKG is a typical tracing of electrical activity of the heart, reflecting the electrical activity of the heart, which means, and this is what it means is this. So it sounds very redundant. Okay, so what it means is this: is that It's a tracing of the electrical activity of the heart, which reflects the electrical activity of the conduction system of the heart. So when you look at the EKG, what it does is that it records, the EKG is a tracing of the electrical activity produced by the conduction system of the heart. And so the electrical signals are produced and distributed by the conduction system, and they're measured by electrodes placed on the body surface. So if you look at the image, the top image that we have here, you can see the electrodes are placed on the body surface, and these electrodes will collect all these electrical signals from the patient, and the machine will gather all the signals and produce a tracing, which represents what's called the EKG. Now let's look at the typical tracing of the EKG. So you have the P wave, you have the QRS, and you have the T wave. So what that means is this, is that on exam, I'm going to give you this image without the P, QRS, and T wave. So on exam, there's no labeling of anything, just this image. And I will ask you a question on what does this mean? What does this mean? And what the QRS and what does the T wave mean? Okay, so let's go one by one. The P wave. In the P wave, we have what represent what's known as the P wave is a tracing, but what it means is this, is that the P wave represents the atrial depolarization, which produces produces what's known as the P wave. So during the P wave, you have what's known as atrial contraction. So the atrial depolarization occurs during the P wave. So what that means is that so during the P wave, during the recording of the P wave, it represents atrial contraction. So let me mention this really quick, and I want to really mention this really quick, is I'll come back to this and talk more about this. Okay, so the QRS, what does the QRS represent? The QRS represent what's known as ventricular depolarization, which accompanies what's known as ventricular contraction. And the T wave represents what's known as ventricular repolarization, which accompanies with ventricular relaxation. All right, so what I'm going to do right now is that I'm going to tell you what occurs during the P wave, what occurs during the QRS, and what occurs during the T wave. So let's go to the next page, and let's transition into the PowerPoint, a blank PowerPoint, and you are going to see a few things. Okay, so and I want you to take a picture of this because it's not a part of the PowerPoint that you guys have. So this is what I want to basically have a blank screen for you guys, like always. And this is what I would do in class. I'm going to have basically is I'm showing you guys this. What I'm going to do now is that I'm going to basically make a I'm going to break this into boxes. So I want to have let's go with 4 columns. Okay, let's go with 4 columns for now, and let's go with 4 rows for now. Okay, so let's go with one by one. All right. So this is what you see with the EKG. Okay, so what does the EKG mean? Okay, so on the EKG, you can see what's called the tracing on the EKG. So I'm going to basically make this as gray, and I'll darken this. Okay, good. The tracing on the EKG, so you have the P wave, you have the QRS complex, you have what's called a T wave. Now, what does the P wave mean, and what does the QRS complex mean, and what does the T wave mean? As you know, the tracing on the EKG represent what's called represent the recording of the electrical activity involvement. So what that means is that you have what's called electrical activity involved. Okay? So during the P wave, which represents, so in terms of electrical activity, the P wave represents what's known as, so the P wave represents what's known as atrial depolarization. Now, what that corresponds with is going to be what's known as mechanical activity. So the P wave represents atrial depolarization, which corresponds with the atrial contraction, which means the contraction of the atria. Okay. What that means is when the atria contract, that means it ejects blood from atria into ventricles. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization, and the the ventricular depolarization corresponds with ventricular contraction to eject blood from ventricles into the two circuits. And the last one would be the T wave. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization, which corresponds with the ventricular relaxation. So once again, is this the EKG, so the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave are tracing on the EKG, and the tracing represent the recording of the electrical activity involvement. So what that means is that the P wave represents atrial depolarization, which corresponds with the atrial contraction. So keep in mind this, electrical activity corresponds with mechanical activity. So mechanical activity just means that, in this case, it means contraction or relaxation. Okay, so it could be one of those two. Now, the QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization, which corresponds with the ventricular contraction to eject blood from the ventricles into the two circuits. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization, which corresponds with ventricular relaxation. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment. I'll come back to the last. For now, let's just finish this, and I will cut this. And if you want to take a picture of this, take a picture of this, and good, very good. So let's transition back into the PowerPoint. All right, any question on the EKG? Any question on the EKG? So let's go to EKG once again is this, okay? So it's a tracing of the electrical activity produced by the conduction system of the heart. And what that means is this, is that the electrodes are placed on the body and they collect all these signals produced by the conduction system of the heart, and they transmit the signals back into the machine, and the machine collects all the signals, and the machine generates the tracing of the EKG. Let's move into the cardiac cycle. Okay. If you recall what I said, once again, what exactly is the cardiac cycle? The cardiac cycle represents the performance of the heart within one heartbeat. And the cardiac cycle consists of two phases. Systole and diastole. So once again, is that the cardiac cycle is defined as the performance of the heart within one heartbeat. And the cycle consists of two phases, systole and diastole. So let's begin with this. So I'm going to use this image on the exam. Okay, so basically just memorize what's going on. Memorize what's going on. I'm going to go over with you bit by bit. Now, do keep in mind is that the purpose of the heart is a pump. What happens is it as it pumps, it produces the pressure, the blood pressure needed to drive the volume within the two circuits, the pulmonary and the systemic circuits. So there are two events that occurs within the heart. You have contraction and relaxation. Systole refers to contraction. Diastole refers to relaxation. So let's begin with A. Atrial systole begins. So you can actually see in this image right here is that you have the contraction of the atria, the left and the right side. And what it means is that it ejects the volume into the ventricles. Okay, so it ejects the volume into the. So what it does is that so it ejects. So in atrial systole, what I want to mention this really quick is that the atria eject the blood into the relaxed ventricle. Now, before I move on, is that I want you to know, as you can see right here, is that the arrow shows that the blood goes from the blood flow goes from atria into ventricles. All right. B, atrial systole ends, which means the atrial relaxation. So what that means is that the flow stops and what that means is that so the valve to prevent backflow. So as you can see, you have the atrial relaxation, which means the flow stops, and the valve closes to prevent backflow. So as you can see in this case is that the arrow goes back, but since the valves aren't opening, the blood can't go back into the atrium. So C, ventricular systole, first phase. So this first phase is called isovolumetric contraction. So look at C, isovolumetric contraction. What that means is this: is that the ventricle begin to contract and generate pressure, but not enough to open the semilunar valve. And for that reason, the volume, the blood volume in the ventricles remain the same. Okay. What that means is this. What that really means is there's no flow So let me fix this first so you can see this. So it's really hard to fix this because I want to make sure everything goes into one so you can see what I'm typing right here. So I want to make sure that you can see everything on this. There you go. So there's no flow out of the ventricles. Once again, is in the isovolumetric contraction. What that means is the ventricles begin to contract and produce the pressure, but the pressure is not high enough to open the semilunar valves, which means the blood volume in the ventricles remain the same. And what that means is there's no blood flow out of the ventricles, so the volume remains the same. Next one is going to be called ventricular systole, second phase, which is called ventricular ejection. So what that means is that the ventricles, I should say, continue to contract and generate more pressure enough to open the semilunar valves, so to eject the blood volume out of the ventricles and into the two circuits. And when I say two circuits, that means the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So you can see in this image right here, you can see that the ventricles contract to open the two valves, semilunar valves, to eject the blood into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Very good. Let's move on to letter E, ventricular diastole. And we know diastole means relaxation. So in this case, it is known as isovolumetric relaxation, which means the ventricles begin to relax and the pressure in the ventricle gradually decrease. but not enough. So the atrioventricular valves could open. So for that reason, the volume in the ventricles remain the same. So what that means is this isovolumetric relaxation just means that the ventricles begin to relax and the pressure in the ventricles gradually decreases, but the pressure is still high enough that the atrioventricular valves remain to be closed. And for that reason, the volume in the ventricles remain the same. So during the isovolumetric relaxation, the semilunar valves and the atrioventricular valves are closed. And for that reason, the volume remains the same. And the same goes for the isovolumetric contraction. In this case, we can say the semilunar valves and the atrioventricular valves are closed. Moving on to F, ventricular diastole, the later part of it. And in this case, you have the heart filling, which we have what's called passive filling. That means all chambers are relaxed as as all chambers are relaxed, the blood returns back into the heart, into the atria from the two circuits, pulmonary, and systemic. So you can see right here is that all the blood returns back into the atria, then into the ventricles from the two circuits. So what you see right here is going to be, let's look at F. Okay, let's look at the letter F. First, since the pressure in the atria and the ventricles are dropping, which allows the blood goes back into the atria from the two circuits and then into the ventricles next after from the atria. So once again, in ventricular diastole, the heart muscles become relaxed, which means the pressure within the heart decreases, which promotes the blood returning back from the circuits back into the atria and then back into the ventricles. So the blood goes back into the atria first, and from the atria, the blood returns back into the ventricles. Or we can say is the blood returns back into the atria first, and from the atria, the blood goes into the ventricles. So this represents the cardiac cycle. So on the exam, I'm going to have this image for you guys. And what I want you guys to do is this, and it's going to be a type of matching type of question. And what you see in the box that says atria ejects blood into relaxed ventricles, I'm going to ask you to match them. Okay, so match what you see with the what I have A, B, C, and so on. Okay, so it's gonna be a matching type of question. So I'll put A here, B here, C, D, and so on. So A, B, C, D, and I should say D, and then E, C, right here I should say C. We can say E, and we can say F. All right, any question on this? Okay, now, well, let's go back to the chart that we made a while back. So let's go back to the chart that we made a while back. So I want you guys to look at this. This is the chart I gave you guys a while back. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add more boxes, more columns, I should say. I'm going to add columns on the left, on the right side. I don't think I can add columns. I can do is I can split the cells into 2 columns. Yes. Perfect. Okay. So now let's ask the question. So let's make it more proportional on this. And go with that. And we can basically say that the valves or let's use the word involvement of the valves and let's go with the P wave. So in the P wave, what we have is that we have blood pumping from the atria into the ventricles. So what that means is that the atrioventricular valves remain open, while the semilunar valves remain closed. Okay, very good. Let's move on to the QRS complex. In the QRS complex, what we have is going to be the atrioventricular valves remain closed, while the semilunar valves remain open for blood ejection. Very good. And the T wave, what we can say is that we can in the T wave we could say that the atrioventricular valves remain closed, and also the semilunar valves remain closed as well. And now I'm going to add one more to this. Okay, so if you want to take a picture of this, let's go with the next one. I'm going to add one more box to this, one more column, I should say, not box, one more column on this, and I'm going to basically add one more column. Okay, good. So now with this column, what I'm going to do next with this column is, this has to be perfect. So with the column, I'm going to add a few things to this. And I am going to move the column over. And the last one, I will put heart sounds. S1, S2. As you know, the heart sounds are produced when the valve closes. Okay, So when the valve closes, that's when you produce heart sounds. So we know for a fact is in the P wave, okay, does not correspond with any heart sounds. In the QRS, it corresponds with the S1, the closure of the atrioventricular valves. Now make a note of this. When the valves are open, there's no heart sounds produced. When the valves close, that is when you produce heart sounds. So as the valves close, that is when you produce the heart sounds. And for the T wave, it corresponds with the S2, closure of the semi-lunar valves. So when the valves close, that is when the heart sound is produced. So once again is that on the exam, I'm going to expect you guys to know basically what happened in the P wave electrically, what happened in the P wave mechanically, which valves are involved with the P wave in the sense of opening and closing for the valves. And also it's going to be opening and closing, all right, for the valves. And also is that I expect you to know the heart sounds produced that corresponds with a P wave, QRS, and the T wave. Any question on this? Very good. Let's move on to the next one. So let's transition back into the PowerPoint. So any question on the cardiac cycle? So make sure that you need to know the image. Okay, so you need to know the image on this because I am going to ask you of this image. Okay. All right, moving on to the next one. Okay. Cardiac output. Okay, so cardiac output refers to the blood ejected by the ventricles per minute. So the cardiac output represents what's known as the blood volume ejected from the ventricles per minute. The cardiac output is an overall indicator of the blood flow, which is a physiological measurement of cardiac function. So they always use the cardiac output to measure the cardiac function. So there's an equation for cardiac output. So the equation is going to so you are going to be required to do math on the upcoming exam. So the equation for cardiac output is equation for cardiac output is you take the stroke volume, you multiply by the heart rate. So the equation for cardiac output is stroke volume multiplied by the heart rate. Any question on this? I'll zoom in for you to see. Okay. So the cardiac output is the blood volume ejected from the ventricles per minute. And the equation for cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. Okay, moving on to the next one. We're going to focus on stroke volume. What exactly is stroke volume and what is heart rate is set by. So let's talk about the heart rate. The heart rate, as you know, is going to be set by the SA node. So what exactly is the stroke volume? The stroke volume is defined as the blood volume ejected from the ventricles per heartbeat. So with every heartbeat, the blood volume is ejected out of the heart, that volume represents the stroke volume. So on exam, don't get confused. If I were to define this on exam, I said true or false. The stroke volume is the blood volume ejected from the ventricles per heartbeat. Okay, so on exam, I could ask a true or false question. This true or false question. Okay. All right. So the question is going to be true or false. The cardiac output is the blood volume ejected from the heart, the ventricles, the heart per minute. And the answer is correct. Stroke volume is the blood volume ejected from the ventricles per minute. And the answer is false. Instead, it should be per to the volume ejected per heartbeat. That is the definition of stroke volume. The volume ejected from the blood per heartbeat. Any question on this? We can move on. Yeah. So on exam, I expect you to know how to do the find the equate, find the cardiac output, find the stroke volume, assuming I have to give you the number for the heart rate and so on. So we'll come back and work on this in a moment. Stroke volume. Okay, so the stroke volume, the equation is, so once again, the stroke volume is defined as the blood volume ejected from the heart, ejected from ventricles per heartbeat. Okay. Does that make sense? So I'm hoping that you can see this right now. Okay. And the equation for the stroke volume is, the equation is stroke volume equals to EDV minus ESV. So what exactly is EDV and what does ESV represent? So EDV is defined as end diastolic volume, which is defined as the volume in the ventricles prior to contraction. So what that means is this, is that it could be defined as volume in the ventricles before ventricular contraction. ESV represents end systolic volume, which is defined as the volume, the blood volume in the ventricles after ventricular contraction. So what that means, the ESV represents what's called residual volume in the ventricle after contraction of the ventricles. So you take EDV, the volume in the ventricle before contraction, minus the ESV, which is the volume in the ventricle after contraction. What the difference between the two value will represent stroke volume, which is defined as the blood volume ejected from the ventricles per heartbeat. There are three factors that affect the stroke volume. Number one, contractility. Number two, preload. Number three, afterload. Let's define what that means is this. Okay. Contractility means the strength of the heart muscles. The stronger the heart muscles, the higher the stroke volume. That makes sense. If the heart muscle is weak, the stroke volume will be diminished. Preload. The preload represents the initial stretching of the cardiac muscles before contraction. So the preload is also referred to as the EDV. What that means is this, is that the volume inside the ventricles before contraction. So as the volume exists inside the ventricles, it causes the ventricles to expand, stretch out. And as you know, muscles can recoil. So when you stretch out the muscles, it recoils back, which means it's the initial pressure within the, so it's the initial pressure within the ventricles before contraction. So what happens is, so the preload represents what's known as, referred to as, I should say, the EDV. The afterload is going to be the resistance that the heart must eject the blood against. Okay. So the afterload represents the resistance within the aorta and the pulmonary trunk that the heart, that the ventricles must overcome in order to eject the blood out of the ventricles. What that means is this, is that if the resistance in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk were to increase, that means the afterload is would increase. Okay. So there's a correlation in this case is this. Okay. So here's an example. I can give you this example. Resistance increase. If there's an increase in resistance in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, this would also causes, therefore, causing the afterload to increase. All right. So once again is this, let's see what happened to how these three factors affect the stroke volume. Number one, increase in contractility, or the strength of this, strength of the muscles will result in an increase in stroke volume. The preload is the same thing. Increase in preload will result in an increase in stroke volume. And the third one is that an increase in afterload will cause the stroke volume to be a decrease in stroke volume. So the more resistance the more resistance found in the aorta and pulmonary trunk, the less volume will be ejected unless the ventricles must increase the force of the contraction. So once again, you can see that there's for the number one and number two, there's a linear correlation between. So number one, there's a linear correlation between contractility and stroke volume. And number two is the same thing, is that there's a linear correlation between preload and stroke volume. Number three, there's an inverse correlation between afterload and stroke volume. What that means is if one goes up, the other one goes down. Very good. Let's move on to the next one. So in the Wiggins diagram, let's do the Wiggins diagram. Okay, so the Wiggins diagram, what it does is it examines the EKG, the heart sounds, the pressure waves, and the volume within the ventricles. So as you can see in the EKG, you have, so let's begin with the first part of the Wiggins diagram. So the Wiggins diagram examines the EKG, examines the heart sounds, examines the pressure wave, and examines the volumes within the ventricle. So let's go with the first one. And by the way, I'm going to use this on the exam. First one, EKG, P, QRS, and T wave. I'm going to use this image right here that you see, this image to be used on exam. Image on exam. I mentioned this a while back. Any question on this? We're done. We're done with the EKG and we're done with the heart sounds. Now let's go to the pressure wave. Okay, are you guys ready? Let's begin with the pressure wave. Okay. So what I want you to look at with this graph is that I want you to correlate with the labeling on this. Okay, so let's go begin with number one. Okay, number one represents what's known as the pressure in the atria is increasing. Okay, you see number one. So it says atrial contraction. Number two represents what's called atrial ejection. Are we okay? Now, number three, what you can see is, so this represents the pressure wave. Okay? And number three, you can see, so once again, I'm going to make a little note on this. The red line, I'm going to make a little note on the side. Okay, I'll make a little note on the side right now. Okay. The red line represents what's known as ventricular pressure. The blue line represents what's known as the atrial pressure. The black line represents what's known as aortic pressure. So when you look at these lines, they represent the pressure of different space, such or different parts. For example, blue line represent. So the blue line right here represent what's known as the pressure of the atrium. The red line represents the pressure of the ventricle, and the black line represents the pressure of the aorta. So Let's begin with 1, 2, and so on. In 1, you can see the pressure of the atria, the pressure of the atrium is gradually increasing. What that means is it corresponds with the atrial contraction. And with 2, you can see the pressure in the atrium is gradually moving up, which means that corresponds with atrial ejection. Now at 3, the pressure of the ventricle is higher than the pressure of the atrium. So I'm going to make a note on 3. I'm going to put down as the pressure at 3, the pressure in the ventricle. So PV means the pressure in the ventricle. Pressure in the ventricle. I'll put left ventricle pressure is greater than the left atrial pressure. And as a result of this, you have the opening of the, or we can say, not the opening, the closure of the mitral valve, which means you can hear S1. So the closure of the mitral valve will produce what's known as, the closure of the mitral valve produces what's known as S1. Okay. Now, for 4, you can actually see, the pressure in the ventricle is rising rather quickly. Okay. So what that means is that it corresponds with what's known as isovolumetric contraction. So what that means is that in isovolumetric contraction, we can say is the pressure in the ventricle is gradually rising, but not enough to open the semilunar valves. Okay. So in this case, we're only going to focus on aortic valve. Okay. Why don't I put semilunar aortic, or let's use the word open the aortic semilunar valve. Thus, the blood volume, there's no blood flow out of the ventricle, out of the left ventricle, and therefore the volume remains the same. So volume in left ventricle remains the same. All right. Any question on this? So you can see in this case we have 4. Is that there's a rise in the pressure in the ventricle, but it's rising but not enough to open the aortic valve. Let's go on to the next one, number 5. All right, so what I want you guys to do now is this. Right here, right there, in the box. Okay. So I'm gonna basically put that box right here. Okay. So that box represents, at that little box, I'll put a little X right here. I'll put an X. Okay. I'll put a little X right here. Okay. That X represents what's known as, so exactly at that X, we can say is that exactly at here, we can say the pressure in the aortic pressure, or the pressure in the left ventricle, is greater than the pressure in the aorta, which causes the opening of the aortic semi-lunar valve, thus allows blood to be ejected out into the aorta, which is known as ventricular ejection. So in the ventricular ejection, you can say the left ventricle ejects blood out into the aorta. So what that means is that you have blood flow from the left ventricle out into the aorta. And we can say at 5, we can say that's what we have. We can say blood flows at 5. All right. Now, 6. Okay. I want you to look at this box as 6. It's 6 right here. Right here. This little tiny box right here. Look at the box. Okay. What you see at 6 is going to represent what's known. I'll put a little X right here at 6 as well. Okay. What that means is that at the box, what that we can say is that the aortic valve or the aortic pressure is greater than the left ventricular pressure at the X, okay. And which causes, therefore, you have closure of the aortic semi-lunar valve. All right. Now, let's continue down here, number 7. You can see that there's a decrease in the pressure of the ventricle. So we have what's called isovolumetric relaxation, which means that we can say in isovolumetric relaxation, we can say isovolumetric relaxation, which means that the pressure in the ventricles gradually drops, but the pressure is not low enough to open the mitral valve. Therefore, no flow occurs because the mitral valve and the is close. All right. And which means the volume, blood volume in the ventricle, the left ventricle remains the same. Right. Now number 8, I'm going to mark this box right here, number 8. So look at where number 8 is at. You can see that the pressure in the ventricle is gradually dropping while the pressure in the atrium is higher than the pressure in the ventricle. So at exactly at 8 right here, at 8 right here, the mitral valve opens and you have passive filling. So the mitral valve opens and you have passive filling. And by the way, number 6, going back to number 6, this represent the closure of the aortic semilunar valve represent what's known as S2. Okay. So here is where you have what's known as S2. The closure of the aortic valve corresponds with S2. All right, so we're done with this page. Let's move on to the next one. Any question on this? Good. Let's move on to the next one. Next slide. Okay. The next slide, this slide represents the volume tracing within the ventricles. Okay. Make sure you guys recognize this image for the exam. So what we can say is this, is that the stroke volume, the equation for stroke volume is equal to EDV minus ESV. So the difference between EDV and ESV represents stroke volume. So as you recall, EDV represents the volume in the ventricle before contraction. ESV is the volume, the residual volume in the ventricle after ventricular contraction and ejection. So the volume that leaves, the difference in volume between the EDV and ESV represents stroke volume. So the stroke volume is defined as the blood volume ejected from the heart, ejected from the ventricles per heartbeat. So you see EDV minus ESV equal to stroke volume. So let's ask the question is, what is the stroke volume based on this graph? What is the stroke volume? Now let's look at the y-axis. You can see in the y-axis, this represents what's known as the volume in the ventricle. So at EDV represent 100, EDV represent 120 ml. The ESV represent is going to be 50 ml. The stroke volume is going to be defined in the equation wise. Using the equation, the stroke volume is 1 EDV 120 ml minus ESV, which is 50 ml, and the stroke volume is 70 ml. Very good. So on exam, I would do the same thing. I have to give you the value for EDV and ESV if I want to find out stroke volume. Or what I can do is this, an example of the question is going to be, so this is an example. So basically it says, so far the equations that you need to know are CO, cardiac output, equal to stroke volume times heart rate. That's the first equation. Second equation would be stroke volume equal to EDV minus ESV. So far, you need to know two equations. Now we know stroke volume is dependent on contractility, which means how strong the muscle of the heart is, preload, which means the volume in the ventricles before contraction, and after load, which means the resistance inside the systemic circuit and pulmonary circuit that the heart has to overcome to eject the volume. So once again, is this after load represent the resistance in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta that the heart must overcome by producing adequate pressure so to be able to eject blood out of the heart and into the two circuits. Okay, very good. Okay. Very good. Let's move on to the last one. Coronary circulation. Now, what that means is this: is that blood flow within the heart. So this what it means is this: is that you have the muscles of the heart requires oxygen. So what that means is this: is that you have blood flow into the muscles of the heart and you have blood flow away from the muscles of the heart. So let's look at the word oxygenated blood. So in this case is that the blood vessels delivering oxygenated blood to the cardiac muscle. And you can see, so I won't ask you that much details on this, okay? I just want you to know. For example, let's begin on this because you need to know this for the lab exam anyhow. So you can see from this is that we have what's known as two coronary arteries, the left and the right. So the left coronary artery bifurcates into circumflex artery and anterior interventricular artery. And the right coronary artery bifurcates into the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. So what you have, so the worrisome part of this is your diet is that cholesterol collects within these blood vessels, which means it obstructs the blood flow to the cardiac muscles, which causes the heart muscles to become weak. Now, keep in mind is that if you deprive any tissue from oxygen, the tissue would die out. So if the heart muscles begin to die out, what will happen is that you are going to have what's called a heart attack. So during a heart attack, what happens is that during a heart attack, the blood vessels have been, so these blood vessels, these coronary arteries are blocked, which means that they cannot deliver oxygen to the muscles and the cardiac muscles begin to die. So the cardiac muscles begin to die, the contractility of the heart will gradually diminish. What that means is if the contractility diminish, what that would happen, it would be the stroke volume would diminish. And if the stroke volume diminish, the blood flow out into the organs would diminish. So what we can say is that a blockage in any of the coronary arteries can lead to the death of cardiac muscles, which would reduce the function of the heart. What that means is, which means the pump, the heart as a pump would become weakened. All right, on the image on the right side, we have what's known as the veins. Okay? So we have what's known as the cardiac veins. Drains deoxygenated blood away from cardiac muscles. And there are different types of cardiac veins. You have anterior, small, great, and middle cardiac veins. But what I want you to know is this, is that in any case, in all cases, cardiac veins, so all the cardiac veins drain the oxygenated blood into a coronary sinus. Coronary sinus, as you can see here, coronary sinus is a bit larger, it's larger, not a bit, it's larger than the cardiac vein. So this is the coronary sinus. It's a lot bigger than the cardiac veins. And so from the coronary sinus, and the coronary sinus drains the oxygenated blood back into the right atrium. And once again, I want you to know is also the two coronary arteries originated from the aorta. So you can see in this image right here, we have the left coronary artery coming from the aorta. So I would type this in as the aorta right here. Aorta. And you can see in this case, it's going to be the aorta as well. Well, in any case right here is this, and in any case we could say is the left coronary artery emerged from the aorta, and the right coronary artery also emerged from the aorta. So what we can say is that the two coronary arteries originated from the aorta. The last statement I want to make is going to be the coronary circulation is a part of the systemic circuits. So the coronary circulation is a part of the systemic circuit. Okay, and that's pretty much it for the heart. This is the second part of the PowerPoint for the heart. So this is the last half of the heart PowerPoint. So I want you to write out a question and ask me questions during the Q&A session.